Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for listening to me. I'm Brian Lacey, and I'm talking to you from the foot of Mount Errigal in the heart of Colmcille country. I'm only about 10 kilometres from the place where he was born. And I just want to start off by thanking Michelle Cashman and Sligo Library for inviting me to give this talk. I know that the story of the battle, so-called Battle of the Both Cathach and Cúl Dreimne, is one of the kind of central stories and very well kind of known and liked and loved maybe in Sligo. But I'm afraid I'm going to throw an awful lot of cold water on that story today. So I hope you'll bear with me. So anyway, we'll launch into the story. I'm going to compare, if you like, what we know from history about these events from what is now the popular legend. And by history, I mean, in a technical sense, history is the reconstruction of the past based on contemporary documentation, whereas legend is, if you like, a story popularly regarded as historical, but not verifiable. And that label fits very much in all the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimne and so on. Now, as you will know by this stage, we're celebrating this year the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St Colmcille. Just to say, he's known also, of course, as Columba, St Columba, which is simply the Latin, and Colmcille is his name that he's usually known in Irish. But the name Colmcille almost certainly wasn't called Colmcille in his own lifetime, that's a kind of part of the growth of his cult as a saint after he died. And that'll become an important issue later on in my talk. Now, we have dates for him. And traditionally, people used to think he was born in 521, but that has been slightly revised now by the research of Dr. Daniel McCarthy from Trinity College in Dublin, who has come up with these new dates. So looking at the revised dates, we would now say that he was probably born in 520. He went to Scotland in 562. The year later, 563, he founded the great monastery of Iona, and he died probably in the year 593. And according to tradition, because there weren't any birth certs in the 6th century, he was born on the 7th of December and died on the 9th of June. So the 9th of June is actually celebrated as his feast day, but his birthday, the day he was born, is traditionally thought of as the 7th of December. Now, Colmcille and himself, and then the monastery he founded on Iona, and the monks that spread out from that, founded many churches and monasteries in Ireland, in Scotland, and indeed in the north of England. And just in the last century, Dr. William Reeves, who was a Church of Ireland bishop, he did an enormous amount of research on Colmcille, and he came up with 56 sites in Scotland and 37 in England. 37 in Ireland, and there's probably about another 10 or dozen in the north of England. And of course, the most important site was Iona, Colmcille, or Colmcille as it's there on that map. And it's a tiny island of a larger island, the Isle of Mull, which is off the west coast of Scotland. And the monastery on Iona became one of the great centres of religious activity, of cultural activity, of scientific activity. In many ways, it was an absolute major centre of learning and science, as well as religion, in the early medieval period. Now, one of the things that it was noted for is that very shortly after Colmcille himself and his monks went to Iona, they began to keep a record, a historical record, a record of contemporary events. And although that has now disappeared, that record no longer survives, but it has survived, as it were, fossilized in later texts. So quotations from it, huge quotations from it, survive in later texts. And we now know these texts as the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of Tirnach, the Annals of the Four Mountains. There are lots and lots and lots of annals. But basically, the father of all these texts is the Iona Chronicle, between the years 560 and about 740. And our history of Ireland, our history of Scotland, during that period really owes its origin to the Iona Chronicle, the chronicle kept by the monks on Iona. And just to say, that was the very beginning of the writing of Irish history. So if you like, the monks of Iona invented the written history of Ireland, and from their records we can then reconstruct later events. Now, for Colmcille himself, we have a number of medieval lives, hagiographical lives. In the Christian church, there's a tradition of writing the lives of a saint. And for Colmcille, we have 3 of these, one written in Latin on Iona by Adamnan in about the year 700, another written in Irish, it's known as the Middle Irish Life. We don't have the name of the author, in Derry, between about 1150 and 1182. And another one then, later one, a huge one in Irish, the Cathach and Cúl Dreimne by Manus O'Donnell, at his castle of a place called Portnatreenawit, which is now near Lifford, Strabane, in East Donegal and West Tyrone, in the year 1532. And in addition, we have several poems, early poems. Now, we have a famous poem called the Evra Colmcille, and people used to think that this was composed on the death of the saint. But recently, a great scholar at Galway University, Jacopo Bisagni, has told us from the research that it was actually made, as we have it anyway, it's from the 9th century, but possibly based on an earlier text. And then we have a couple of poems from the middle of the 7th century. And then in addition to that, we have the annals, and we have some genealogical information as well. Now, in the 3 lives of the saints, the hagiographical lives, places in County Sligo are mentioned several times. And you can see there, in Adamnan's life, Cúl Dreimne is mentioned. In the Middle Irish life, Drumcliff is mentioned. And then in Manus O'Donnell, Drumcliff, Cúl Dreimne. And I have a map of these here, a Hamlish at the North Sligo, Cúl Dreimne and Drumcliff, they're kind of in the middle. And down in South Sligo, a place called, known both as Drumcolumn and Drumcree. Now, one of the major things that happened at Iona, and as indeed in all medieval monasteries, the copying of manuscripts was very important. And some of the most important manuscripts we have from early Ireland come from either Iona itself or from one or other of the Columban monasteries associated with it. So it was a major, and many of these, this is, for instance, is a manuscript of the Vita Columba, the life of Columba, written in Latin on Iona about the year 700. The manuscript dates to about 700. It's now, of all places, in a little town in Switzerland called Schaffhausen. The Book of Durrow is one of our great illuminated books. These books that people talk about, the Book of Durrow, the Book of Kells, the Book of Lindisfarne, and so on and so forth, they are essentially copies of the 4 Gospels. That's essentially what they are. And then other things are, if you like, put in. But essentially, but many of the most important come from monasteries associated with St Colmcille, later than Colmcille, but associated with them. So, for instance, this is one of the greatest English treasures, the Book of Lindisfarne, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Lindisfarne is a little island just north of Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was founded by monks from Iona and was an important Columban monastery. And then, of course, the most famous of all these manuscripts is the Book of Kells. And again, Kells, there's a dispute as to where the Book of Kells was made. Some people say Iona, other people say Kells itself, County Meath. But both of them, of course, are just Columban monasteries. So it was made in a Columban monastery. Now, the oldest Irish illuminated manuscript we have is called the Cathach. And it dates we can't say precisely the date, but it dates to the end of the 6th or the beginning of the 7th century. So I just put, say, roughly 600 there. And the Cathach was one of the great treasures of medieval Ireland, particularly of the O'Donnell family. And as well as the manuscript is now in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, but there was this box, or the Irish word is Cathach, was made for it about the year 1090. And we know it was commissioned by Caithfear McGillicuddy O'Donnell, and it was made in Kells in County Meath. And it was made to contain the manuscript as a shrine for the manuscript, and it wasn't opened. It was kind of locked, and throughout the later period anyway. It was opened in the year 1813, and they expected to find the bones of Colmcille in it, but in fact it was a manuscript. And there's an inscription on it which tells us precisely who had it made and who made it, and so on and so forth. I just go. Now, the Cathach is a copy of the Psalms. It's basically a copy of the Psalms. And we have from Ireland, from roughly the same time, a number of other books of the Psalms. And this is a particularly interesting one. It's almost exactly the same date as the Cathach, but this one, instead of being a manuscript, is actually made on wax tablets, which are held in these wooden cases. And then somewhat later, we have from a bog in the Midlands, the Fadmore Psalter, this remarkable discovery a few years ago. It dates a little bit later, and it was contained in almost like a modern file, the documents and things. And that file is leather, but is lined with papyrus, and that's important. So these are copies of the Psalms, the Psalter, from very early Ireland, and they're of immense importance from a textual point of view as well as everything else. Now, the Cathach is our oldest illustrated or illuminated, is the word that's often used, in manuscript. And as I say, it's basically a copy of the Psalms. Each Psalm is started with one of these initial letters, and then just above it, there's what we call the rubrics. And the rubrics are just red headings, if you like. Now, I'll just summarize a few things here. Traditionally, the Cathach was said to be made by St Colmcille, actually his own handwriting, and it could be, but we can't prove that. It's a copy of the Psalms, as I say, and Adamnan tells us in the life he wrote that the last thing that Colmcille did before he died, the very last thing that's recorded about him, was that he was copying the Psalms. So, if you like, people put the two and two together and say therefore that the Cathach must be the manuscript. Now, only about half of the Cathach, of the original Cathach, survives, and there may have been a highly decorated first page that's lost, and I won't go down through all of these things, but it's written in black ink. We know how the ink was made, with red headings or red-orange headings, and it's written in a style of letters, insular majuscule, which is beautiful, very easy to read now, unlike later texts, for instance. And we know that was written fluently, but without, there wasn't any haste. Strange enough, there are, well, maybe not strangely, there are about 250 errors in the Cathach, in the text, extra letters or lost letters. And there's all of those initial letters that are highly decorated. And the style of the decoration is important because it's a very early style. It comes from the Iron Age, from the European Celtic Iron Age. We call it Latin style, and that's very important. So that dates back into pagan prehistory. But interestingly also, as you will see, there are some crosses on it. And the manuscript was probably kept originally in a leather bag or satchel, but then, as I say, in 1090, this shrine box was made for it. Now, this page here, there's the initial letter, but you can see the page has been lined, and above it's faded on this here, but just above there are what's called the rubrics, the red headings. And you can see all these different initials, beautifully decorated, and all drawn from what I might call the pagan Celtic Iron Age. And this is just a series of these initials. And you can see on some of them, the cross is beginning to appear. Now, the cross is now, of course, the most important symbol of Christianity, but that wasn't the case initially in the first few centuries. And the fish, for instance, and other symbols of Christianity. Now, just to say that if you just look at this cross here, for instance, it is very similar to this cross, which is on a pin, which comes from County Sligo, from Train McMurta, which I think is in southeast Sligo. So you can see this, the cross beginning to emerge as a symbol on, if you like, Christian period art anyway. And here again, that detail, there is the a kind of fish head with a cross on it. And just to compare that, here's a somewhat similar thing from Egypt. Here you have I suppose, a dolphin with a cross on his head. So you can see how these Christian symbols are moving from the Eastern Mediterranean right across into Ireland and into Scotland. Now, to come to the Battle of Cúl Dreimne. It's, as you know, very well known in the Sligo area, and this wonderful painting of it by Bernard McDoom, whom I knew many years ago in a totally different context, and it's a marvelous painting. The Battle of Cúl Dreimne is, or rather was, a real historical event. And Adamnan talks about it here. This is the manuscript of Adamnan's Vita Columbae, the text I said written about 700 and now in Switzerland. And here it's mentioned post Cúl Dreimne bellum, after the Battle of Cúl Dreimne. And here again, another one, post bellum Cúl Dreimne, after the Battle of Cúl Dreimne. So he's mentioning it. And what he uses it as a dating device, because we now have, of course, Anno Domini dating, but people in those days basically didn't, or Anno Domini dating was just beginning to come in. So they dated things from, 2 years after such and such. In the way that, certainly in my young life, people always talked about the war, meaning the Second World War, 10 years after the war or whatever. So the Battle of Cúl Dreimne was being used as a dating device. So he does mention it in this text of about 700, but only as a dating device. And he tells us that 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimne, Columbus sailed across to Scotland to found Iona. That's the sum total of what he says. In the Irish annals, so we mentioned the annals earlier, there are a number of references to the Battle of Cúl Dreimne, but the most reliable of them simply says that it happened. Cathach Cúl Dreimne. Now, these later ones here, I won't go into them fully, but they're later entries into the annals. The annals are like scrapbooks. You stick a newspaper headline in today, and then next week you find a photograph and you stick that in. So there are collections of things that grew. And we can tell, for instance, that these entries about the Battle of Cúl Dreimne are later than the battle. In fact, later than the life of Colmcille, because they use the name Colmcille. They don't call him Columba. They use the name Colmcille, which is a late Colmcille there, which is a late. And there are other, I could spend a lot of time talking about those, but I don't want to get too bogged down. Now, as everybody knows, the Battle of Cúl Dreimne occurred somewhere at the foot of Benbulben in the townlands, the usual suggesting the townlands of Culdrumman and Urlor near Drumcliff. And again, most people are familiar with what are the causes of the battle. The famous judgment, Colmcille copies a book belonging to St. Finian, and Finian is annoyed about this, and the case is submitted to the High King Diarmuid MacCarroll, and he gives the famous judgment to every cow's calf, etc. And there's a secondary reason that Diarmuid kills a Connaught prince who's, as it were, under the protection of Colmcille. That's a secondary. Now, that story about the cow, to every cow's calf, is a late story. We don't have it until very late. In fact, we don't have it until the 16th century. That is 1,000 years after the incident itself is supposed to have occurred. And the story first appears in the 14th century in a text called Causa Peregrinationis Sancti Columba, the cause of Colmcille's pilgrimage to Iona, if you like. And but it just talks about the copy story, but doesn't give the judgment. And then a little bit later, we have a text called the Cathach and Cúl Dreimne in the Leabhar Cluine Suibhne, which is a medieval book from here from County Donegal. And it gives us the copy story plus the judgment, but not as the cause of the battle. And then a few years later, we have Manus O'Donnell's Cathach and Cúl of 1532, and it gives the full story, the copying, the judgments, the battle, etc., and so on. And that's just the text of the Leabhar Cluine Suibhne. Le gach bo ali, to every cow its calf, agus le gach leabhar a leabhar, and to every book its little book or its copy. So on. Now, as I said, the most important, or so the biggest, or the fullest account of the whole thing is in Manus O'Donnell's Cathach and Cúl of 1532. And just to say, the book is illustrated by, the first page of the book has this illustration of Colmcille on the front page. And we think that Manus O'Donnell, that's actually Manus O'Donnell's face. He put himself, as it were, into the story. Now, this gives us the fullest account of the Cathach, and this is from Manus's. Further, the Cathach Battle Book is the name of that book, and so on so goes. It tells us, and that it was. I'll use my phone here. If you imagine this is the shrine of the Cathach, well, the keeper of the Cathach put this on his chest like that. There was a chain around it. And he would walk with this into battle in front of the O'Donnells, and that way it was used as a kind of a spiritual weapon. Now, seems possible, according to Reinald O'Flynn, who just retired as director of the National Museum a few years ago, Reinald suggests that the Cathach, but not known as that by that name, but known as the Suscail Martin, or the Gospel of St. Martin, was one of the great treasures of Derry in the 12th century. And that then after that, it became used by the O'Donnells as a battle weapon, as a spiritual weapon. And that, in a sense, it then acquired the name, the Cathach. And then later on again, if you like, a story was evolved to explain that name. Now, the king in the story, the High King, and this is the across the scriptures, Monastery Boys, and on the base of it here, there's a sculpture, and this is supposed to be Diarmid, who's founding the monastery of Clonmacnoise with St. Ciarán there, but this is Diarmid. So he's the demon in the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimne. But actually, and he's shown as an enemy of Colmcille and an enemy of Colmcille's people. But in actual fact, he was almost certainly a cousin of Colmcille. He wasn't some remote king from another part of the country, but he was actually a cousin of Colmcille. And this, by the way, that genealogy has been worked out by the late Alva McGavran. Now, in the story, you'll know that after the battle, because the battle occurred, and because in the story, Colmcille was responsible for it in a way, and of course so many people died, that Saint Malasha of Inishmurray, also of Devonish and of Ahimlasha in North Sligo, that, as it were, Malasha tells him it's time to leave Ireland in penance. And Malasha, so there's Inishmurray down there. Malasha is the saint, principal saint of a kingdom of the people here called the Kenil Carabra. Colmcille belonged to these people here, the yellow up here, Kenil Cúl. So Colmcille is the saint of Kenil Cúl. Malasha is the saint of the Sligo kingdom of Kenil Carabra. And in a sense, they're both kind of champions for each other's kingdoms. Now, I just go back here a second. The date of this map is 550. Kenil Cúl is the yellow here. Shortly after this, Kenil Cúl begins to expand. So here we are. And now they're actually up against the Kenil Carp. Kenil Carp stretch all the way to North Sligo and up into South Donegal. So these are now neighbours and indeed enemies. And Kenil Cúl continues to push Kenil Carp out of Donegal. These are two kingdoms, as it were, in conflict with each other, neighbouring kingdoms. And so from before the 500 or thereabouts, down to the 12th century and later, the principal conflict in that part of Ireland, where Sligo and Donegal border, where the borders of Sligo and Donegal, Leitrim as well, of course. But the principal conflict is between these two kingdoms, the Kenil Cúl and the Sligo kingdom of Kenil Carp. And Colmcille belongs to the Kenil Cúl. The Battle of Cúl Dreimne, almost certainly, which we know existed as a real battle, there's no doubt about that. That battle, almost certainly, and almost impossibly, it couldn't be anything else, had to be a battle between Kenil Cúl and Kenil Carp, even though subsequent history forgot about that. And Colmcille, as I said, was the principal saint of Kenil Cúl, and Malasha was the principal saint of Kenil Carp. So the stories of the alleged conflict between these two saints really is a kind of fictional surrogate for the real political conflict between their respective peoples. I'm just going to flash through some of these things. You'll know these images anyway. So the story of the Battle of Cúl Dreimne, as it's now well known, and in Bernard's famous painting, is not history. It's medieval, fanciful medieval literary fiction. There is absolutely no evidence, historical evidence, that Colmcille had any part in the battle or was involved in any way in the reasons that brought it about. And these are kind of scandalous allegations made against Colmcille. I feel almost obliged to defend Colmcille, that he did not cause the battle and he did not cause the death of 3,000 people or whatever it's said to be. This is pure medieval fiction. The story really is a kind of a medieval novel. But people often say, well, Drumcliff, which is just beside Cúl Dreimne, and that was a Columban monastery, a Colmcille monastery. But again, almost certainly that's not precisely true. You might remember earlier on I mentioned the Middle Irish life of Colmcille, written about the year 1150. Well, this sends Colmcille on a journey around Ireland. Here you can see in the map. And as he goes around, he founds various monasteries, including Drumcliff. But that is a 12th century view of things. That's just the text that tells us about the foundation of Drumcliff. I'll skip through it. When you look at the actual historical evidence, almost certainly Drumcliff was not founded by Colmcille and was not in any way associated with the Columban churches. Here an article by Anthony Camden in a book published in 2006 says no earlier than the 8th century. So there's no Columban connection with Drumcliff earlier than the 8th century. In fact, I believe it was later again. Early Irish churches were to a great extent family businesses, and their foundation and continuation was to a great extent an expression of local political identities and so on, rather than purely religious purposes. Again, just to come back to the maps, you remember here's Kenil Cúl, Colmcille's people in yellow, and down there is Kenil Carp, Malasha's people, if you like. And those two kingdoms are enemies of each other right through. They're constantly pushing and shoving each other back, north of the Erne, south of the Erne, so on and so forth, all through the early Middle Ages. In 789, there's a famous battle, and Kenil Cúl are shoved south of the Bluestack Mountains, down here into South Donegal. And they've nowhere to move. They can't move that way, or that way. So their only possibility of moving is south, down into Kenil Carp territory. And Kenil Carp which is, I think, the barony of Carbery in Sligo now. And that kingdom originally stretched all across the north of Ireland, right down from Sligo, all across. There's a place in County Longford, and right down into County Kildare. So the original Kenil Carbery kingdom was much bigger than just the tiny barony of Carbery in Sligo. I'm going to skip through these because I'm tied for time. Kenil Colmcille's people started here in East Donegal. And these arrows showed them expanding out into Donegal. And down here, particularly, this is really what's important. Down here, gradually, they win all these battles in these years, and eventually they arrive at the Erne. And the Erne becomes their border with the Sligo kingdom of Kenil Carbery for several centuries. And in several texts here, for instance, the so-called tripartite light of Patrick, it tells us that the Assay Rua, the waterfall on the River Erne, is still their boundary. And here again, a bit later, we have a text called the Baha Adavnon. And once again, the Kenil Connell and the Kenil Carbery as were meet for a parley at Assaro on the Erne. So the Erne is still the border between them. But in the year 1000, this man, Mulrooney and Weldury, becomes king of Kenil Colmcille's people. And he sets out, I won't go into all of this, he sets out to push south across the Erne and down into what's now North Sligo. And we know that eventually he takes over. I'm just trying to look here. Yeah, by 1011, his territory, Kenil, so another king, Flaherfrog, king of Islay, led an army into Kenil Connell as far as Drumcliff and Tiochla, Ballysadare. So by 1011, Mulrooney, this guy up here, has crossed the Erne, pushed down into South Sligo and conquered North Sligo. And it's in that context that Drumcliff, which was almost certainly formerly a monastery dedicated to St Malasha, gets, as it were, handed over to the Columban monks and becomes a monastery dedicated to Saint Columba. Now, the earliest evidence of that may be on this cross here. Peter Harbison, who's a great expert on Irish high crosses, for instance, talks about that there's no parallel for the head of this cross, but I would suggest that this might be a parallel. This is a cross on Iona, St. Martin's cross on Iona, and at the heart of St. Martin's cross is this depiction of the Virgin and Child. And on the south face, that's unfortunately, I don't think I have a drawing. Oh, there we are, sorry. So just there on that face, here on Drumcliff, we have the Virgin and Child on the Drumcliff. And this is the only depiction of that image in Ireland, in medieval Ireland. Now, the Virgin and Child is one of the great images of Renaissance art, but in medieval times it was very unusual. But it appears consistently in Columban context, Columban monasteries. So here we have it at Drumcliff, there we have it on Iona, on one cross on Iona, there it is again on another cross on Iona, and there it is in the Book of Kells. And as I said, the Book of Kells is one of the great Columban manuscripts. And here we have in a poem from Iona, written by this man, composed by this man, Cochedna, again, praising Mary as the mother and so on and so forth. So what we really have at Drumcliff is a monastery almost certainly originally dedicated to and possibly founded by Saint Malasha, not by Saint Columba, and remained a monastery dedicated to Saint Columba until the early decades of the 11th century, when Mulrooney and Weldury, king of Kenil Connell in Donegal, comes down and takes over that part of Sligo. And it may be that he, as part of his rededication of Drumcliff to St Colmcille, he erects that high cross, and indeed the round tower cross. And if you like, from then on, Drumcliff is associated as a Columban church. So to sum up my lecture, Adamnan tells us that Colmcille went to Scotland 2 years after the Battle of Cúl Dreimne, but he does not say that, or suggest even, that Colmcille had any role in the battle. There is in fact no evidence whatsoever that Colmcille had any connection with the battle. The Cathach, the manuscript of the Psalms, which is often said to have been written by Colmcille, is certainly of roughly the right date, but his authorship cannot be proved, nor indeed can it be disproved. The Battle of Cúl Dreimne was a real historical battle, almost certainly fought between the Ceinill Conaill, Colmcille's people, and Ceinill Carapra, the Sligo kingdom. And after the battle, which Ceinill Carapra almost certainly won, they invaded South Donegal. The Ceinill Carapra, the Sligo kingdom of Ceinill Carapra, invades South Donegal. But in the centuries following, they're slowly and gradually pushed out of Donegal again, as far south as the River Erne. And then in the early 11th century, the Ceinill Conaill push down into Sligo. They reverse, if you like, the situation from the Ceinill Carapra coming up into Donegal. Now it's the Ceinill Conaill going down into Sligo. And they take over North Sligo, and they rededicate the former church of St Malasha at Drumcliff. They rededicate it as a church dedicated to St Columba. And the cross with the Virgin and Child motif on it may be the earliest physical evidence we have for that, as it were, Columbanization of the church of at Drumcliff, and that dates to roughly about the year 1000, 1020, something like that. So to add then that the famous copyright story, the Battle of the Books, the Battle of Cúl Dreimne, the famous story we have of it is not history. It is 16th century fiction, not 6th century fact. So there you are. I leave it at that. Thank you.